Welcome to Case Note Friday. My name's Fatan. I'm a family law solicitor practicing in Sydney, Australia, and this is a story based on a High Court decision of Kramer, Anor and Stone. It's a goodie. Let's get into it. It's somewhat complicated, so try and keep up. Many years ago in the 1960s, this guy, we'll call him David's dad. David's dad struck a deal with an owner of a farm in Coal River, New South Wales. They struck a deal with a share farming agreement, which said he's going to work the land, he's going to farm the land, and the owner of the land will allow him to do that if they shared the profits. They entered into this share farming agreement in the 1960s, and it worked pretty well for them. It was in a place called Coal River, New South Wales, and he owned 100 acres. So he owns the land, he's just working on the land. I'll show you what we're talking about. This is the lovely Coal River, New South Wales. That's what we're fighting about. Over time, David's dad doesn't want to do farming anymore, and he says to his son, you take over the share farming agreement I've got with the landowner, and you can then be the farmer working on the land. You get the share profits, you work the land, you don't own the land, you get the share profits, and they also got a small retainer every quarter. So he agreed to do that. David loves the farming business, he's living on the land and is very happy. Now, ultimately, the landowner sells. He sells in the 1980s to this couple. We have Dr. Harry and Dame Leonie. They then own the farm. David is still working the farm. He strikes up an oral agreement, meaning it wasn't in writing, it was just a verbal agreement between Dr. Harry and David. They have a deal that says David will continue to share farm on the land and they will share the profits. They live on the land. There's a cottage there. They live there, but he does. It's 100 acres. He does too, and he will continue to share in the profits. Now, Dr. Harry makes a promise, and we call this the first promise. He makes a promise to David that says, if you continue to work on the land and you continue to share farm in this business, I will give you a life interest in this business. This promise was made in the 1980s. A life interest is a legal term that says you won't own the land, but you will get to use the land for the remainder of your life and keep all of the profits, with the exception that his wife would get to still live in the cottage on that farm, but he would be able to earn all those profits. That was the first profit, right? That was the first promise. David would get to live on the land with a life interest once he dies, and she would get the cottage. Once David died, then it would go back to Dame Leonie. That was the promise. David agreed with that, and he was relying on that promise. Years go by, and sadly, Dr. Harry gets cancer. Dr. Harry says now that he's got cancer, he's changed his mind and he's going to change his will. He's going to leave the farm. So there was a life interest. He's not going to do the life interest anymore to David. Instead, he's going to leave the entire farm to Dame Leonie. And Dame Leonie, in turn, because she's elderly and older than him, she will put in her will that David will get the entire farm upon her death. So basically, all he has to do is wait it out and he will inherit the entire 100-acre farm. That was the second promise that was made. David thinks, you know what, that's a pretty good deal. So he continues to work on the farm, slaving his guts out, living in sort of modest conditions. They lived in the cottage. He was living in not so great accommodation, roughing it, as you say. But he understood that all he had to do was work on this farm, where, remember, everyone's sharing the profits, and he will eventually get it. That was the second promise that was made. Dr. Harry says he will eventually get it when she dies, right? So, of course, sadly, Dr. Harry dies from cancer, and Dame Leonie inherits the entire farm. Her and David continue to work on this agreement. Now, that is the share farming agreement. He's working, she's getting the profits. Now, this is where the third promise comes to play. So David said that Leonie said, after he died, this is in 1988, I promise that I will leave in my will this farm to you, and then you can do whatever you like with it. So he relied on that promise. That was the third promise. He's going to inherit this. When she dies, he's going to inherit the land and also a sum of money. And he thought that was a good deal. So he continued to work on the land. He worked on the land for 23 years, expecting that when she dies, he's going to inherit the whole goddamn thing. So can we see what's happening now? Sadly, Dame dies. She dies, and her will leaves the entire farm to her daughter, Hilary Kramer. Hilary inherits the whole farm she didn't completely forget about lovely David. David, here's your 200. She gave David $200,000. The remaining of her estate went to her daughter. Now, Hilary says to David, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know that this farm is yours. Because he's like, a promise was made. A promise was made, bitch. This farm is mine. It's been through many generations this promise has been made. But he didn't have anything in writing. All he had was the oral agreement, the promise that was made, the promises that were made, because there were 3. And Hilary over here is saying, nah, I'm not buying it. This farm is mine, so suck it. You don't get it. So David's like, well, you know what? I don't like this. So he makes an application to the Supreme Court for the estate of Dame Leonie, saying, even though he didn't have the paperwork, but what he did have was the reality of what happened. For 23 years, he'd been working in total on this farm for 40 years, mind you. But since the last promise was made, he'd been working this farm, working his ass off on the expectation that this farm was going to be his. He really did think the farm was going to be his. So he goes to the Supreme Court and he says, promises were made. It's called something called estoppel. That's the legal term, promissory estoppel. I was promised. You can't now say the promise wasn't made. They fight it out in court, and the judge at first instance, that is the first judge of the Supreme Court, says, you know what, I believe you, David. I think the promise was made, and I do think you relied on that promise. So I'm sorry, Hilary Kramer, David gets the farm. Hilary didn't like that. She thought that decision was bullshit. So she appeals to the Court of Appeal. Let me show you what happened. It's noted that David was seen as an exceptionally credible witness, which means everybody believed him. He spoke in such a good way in that witness box that everybody believed he was telling the truth. The Court of Appeal talked about David's reliance on the promise. The respondent, that's David, deposed to his reliance on the promise that he would inherit the property, namely he would not leave the property and he didn't pursue other employment elsewhere. He restricted his personal and domestic life to staying on the property, and he didn't make any attempt to build a super fund or do anything for his retirement because he thought he was going to inherit the property. He relied on that promise. Now remember, Hilary said, I don't know anything about this promise. So because she didn't know about it, was it meaningful? Did that matter? The court said no. The Court of Appeal said the weight of authority favours the conclusion that actual knowledge of the detrimental reliance is not required. It didn't matter that Hilary didn't know about it. The promise was made. He relied on the promise, and her own encouragement that he continued to work the farm was also seen as a relevant factor. So the appeal was dismissed. That wasn't the end of the story. The estate of the late Dame Leonie appealed to the High Court of Australia. They were granted special leave to appeal. So Hilary basically said, I don't like that decision. I'm appealing it, David. I want this farm. So the High Court reviewed all of the evidence and they discussed this notion of estoppel and said this is a clear estoppel case. There are 4 factors, legal factors, that must be satisfied. And in this case, all of them are there. 1, a clear promise was made. Promises were made in previous generations. Dr. Harry made that promise. And of course, Dame Leonie herself made the promise. He relied on that promise. That's the second factor. He continued to work on this farm on the understanding that he would one day get it. He didn't go and move away. He didn't build any superannuation. He deliberately didn't do anything because he knew that this was his retirement plan. He was going to get the farm. Consequences meant he didn't, but he did rely on that promise. A reasonable person, this is the third factor, in David's position would have relied on that promise. And of course, the consequence of him, now that this has come about, the consequence is that he has, to his detriment, the promise was made to him and he suffered loss. He got $200,000 from the estate of the late Dame Leonie, and the original judge had said, you don't get that as well. You get the farm, you don't get the 200K. It was in lieu of the 200K. So he got the farm, but not the 200. The Court of Appeal agreed with that. He didn't get the 200 as well. And the High Court also dismissed the appeal and said, David gets this farm. You don't get it, madam. The promise was made. You can't go back on the promise. I love this decision. The primary judge held that Dame Leonie's promise gave rise to estoppel, entitling Mr. Stone, that's David, to the appropriate equitable relief. He didn't get the 200 as well, in lieu of the 200,000. It didn't matter that Leonie didn't know about it. It didn't matter that she didn't act in a way that was consistent with the agreement because those promises had been made before her. So David won. He got the farm. It was worth about $1.5 million, even though it was all based on an oral agreement, not a written one. So what a great decision. That's all from me. I'll see you next time.